So now we move into the political opening here. And the first parliamentary elections were held, obviously, still under Soviet rule in February of 1990. And they were uncontested. The Communist Party obviously won. Following these elections, two somewhat nationalistic opposition parties began to form. One was the Democratic Party of Tajikistan, and the second was the Islamic Renaissance Party, also known as the IRP. Both of these were seen as threats to the communists, but the IRP made for a much easier target. The communists reacted to the rise of the IRP by outlawing, basically saying in a law on freedom of conscience that the IRP couldn't exist. Now, the DPT, the Democratic Party of Tajikistan, was simply not legalized, so they weren't ever allowed to formally function. Now, the Communist Party also turned inward, trying to solidify its own hold on power. So as it was clamping down on the opposition, it also worked within its own party to strengthen its core. So those leaders who were willing to compromise with other parties were purged. They were thrown out. And now the Communist Party became a party of hardliners. Whereas in much of the Soviet Union, the Communist Party is actually moving the other direction. By now, nationalism permeated through a range of other issues: the standard of living, especially housing shortages, unemployment, the environment. Tajiks, everything was pitted as Tajiks versus the others being those who have been advantaged, ethnic Russians, ethnic Uzbeks being advantaged. And a symptom of this was in February 1990, at the same time that you had the first parliamentary elections, there were riots in Dushanbe that were triggered by rumors, which were false, that Armenian refugees from Azerbaijan, because there was a conflict going on there, had received housing priorities in Dushanbe, where the housing situation was especially poor. So again, focusing on the others as somehow privileged. So already in 1990, you have violence in the streets of Tajikistan. But was this particularly unique in the Soviet Union? No. And was this massive violence? No, but it was significant. And it was a significant harbinger of what was to come. So you've got increased political tensions and this struggle for power. The Leninabad communist elites, aka the Khujandis, after their capital changed names, since it was no longer Leninabad now, it was Khujan, they weren't ideologically committed to Marxism and Leninism. They were no different from Communist Party elites in Uzbekistan, in Turkmenistan, and Kazakhstan, and the rest of the Soviet Union, who really abandoned that sinking ideological ship en masse, and they changed their colors in order to maintain control. But these Leninabad communist elites, their political careers had been made on the grounds that opposition was intolerable, and they sought to maintain these rules on the new field, on the new playing field. So like other Communist Party elites, they had a party apparatus that they could mobilize to maintain control. Again, the divide and rule strategies. The opposition, by contrast, used the strategy of trying to unite various disenfranchised forces. So they sought to end localism, and they even came together, despite their various ideological stances, on common factors that they thought could unite them, and especially the common enemy, being the Communist Party. To some degree, they also all favored a degree of democracy and market reforms, but this wasn't the key uniting factor. The Democratic Party, the DPT, was generally for a parliamentary democracy, and they also had the most diverse ethnic base. The IRP was much more in favor of an Islamic state, but in the long run. They agreed that there should be a secular state in the short run. So the IRP was in many ways sort of a liberal fundamentalist party. Moderation was encouraged by the convergence of official and unofficial Islam, as I mentioned before. The head of religious affairs, Tua Jonzoda, who won the IRP over to much more gradual and a much less radical view, where the church or mosque in this particular case, religion in the state, would remain separate for the near future, and only gradually and democratically would Islamic symbols and structures be brought into the state. Another group that you have here is known as Rastakhoz, which means revival, and it was focused on Tajik nationalism. It was much more about pre-Islamic roots, Zoroastrianism, which was around before Islam came to Tajikistan, than Islam per se. And finally, you've got Lali Badakhshon, which translates as the Ruby of Badakhshon, national democracy, autonomy for Badakhshon, so it's all oriented towards Badakhshon, which is a culturally different region within Tajikistan. Now, of course, all these organizations and any reforms were a threat to power for the Leninabadis and their southern partners, the Kulobis, about 200 kilometers south of Dushanbe. So again, just to put up this sort of picture for you, here we're talking about the dominance of the Leninabadis, and here are their Kulob partners down here. And of course, they rule within Dushanbe, but they don't dominate within the province at large. But the Dushanbe as the capital, they rule. I suppose I could have showed you on that one too. So let's start where Moscow begins to crumble. So we talked about the February 1990 elections, and then we've got the rise of these various parties that come together as really uniting against their enemy, but fairly diverse group of actors. Some of them have been outlawed. Some of them were just never officially registered in the first place. Now, things start to take place in Moscow, which leads to major changes in Tajikistan, in particular the August 1991 coup in Moscow, where the hardliners try to drive Gorbachev out. And I haven't talked about this in great detail. You can read about there was a little bit in your readings, but you can read as much as you want on this. But basically, what happens is things are coming along, and suddenly one day everyone wakes up in the Soviet Union and they find out that Gorbachev is feeling sick and he's in his summer dacha, and there's no news on the TV. There's just occasional government statements, and that's the sign of a coup. And then people take to the streets of Moscow and they defeat the coup. Now, remember, all the Central Asian leaderships at this point, who weren't entirely comfortable with perestroika and glasnost, they saw their hold on power slipping. They were at the forefront in actually supporting this coup. They were quiet about it. Some of them were sort of quietly supportive. They certainly didn't stand up for them. And the Tajik Communist Party was at the forefront, really, of supporting this coup. So you had other soft supporters around Central Asia who had to make some changes when the coup failed, like departyization. The harder line of the Tajik Communist Party led to a much harder fall, because they were the spearhead of support for the coup. When the coup failed, they fell hardest. You had demonstrators that were encouraged by these various opposition parties who ran into the streets, and they demanded that the Communist Party be banned, that its assets be nationalized, that the government resigns, that you have new elections immediately. Now, instead, the Communist Party reinstalled Rakhmon Nabiev, who was a Kulob and the first secretary between 1982 and 1985, when he was purged by Gorbachev as part of the cotton scandal. So now he's reinstalled. And then, out of all the demands, all the communists really gave were contested but rigged presidential elections in November 1991. And so who should win? Well, no surprise, Nabiev defeats the opposition candidate by a margin of 57% to 30%. And he becomes Tajikistan's first president. So the first president of Tajikistan, Nabiev, was actually the first Communist Party secretary in the early 1980s, before Gorbachev came to power and pushed him out in a general purge over corruption. So with this, you've got Nabiev back in power, so the Communist Party is still firmly entrenched, and now frustration is growing among the masses. The continued demonstrations eventually lead to the sacking of the Internal Affairs Minister, who's accused of not doing enough to stop the demonstrations, to bring about peace. And then clan politics take the fore. The Internal Affairs Minister was from the Badakhshan region, which is, again, eastern Tajikistan. And now the Badakhshanis are upset at large because their man in power has been pushed out. And so they run through the streets of Dushanbe demanding his reinstatement. And the opposition backs them, taking advantage of a new ally, a new political opportunity. Whether they like him or not, they see this as a way to ally themselves with the Badakhshanis. On the other hand, by early 1992, the official clergy begins to split from the hardened Communist Party. Tua Jonzoda, who I've mentioned a few times, the highest religious authority in Tajikistan, and also a member of the Supreme Soviet, proposes symbolic changes to take advantage of nationalism. And all these are concerned with religion, making Thursday and Friday days off, bringing about tax exemptions for religious institutions, making religious holidays into national holidays. His proposals were shot down, and in response, he declared, and this is really radical, that there would be no prayers for the dead, janoza, for the communists. No prayer for the dead for the communists. Wow. Now communists are even more out in Tajik society than they were at the height of Soviet power, and relations continue to go downhill. Uh, to, at one point, Turajanzoda even declares that the USSR is criminal, and well, he didn't have much support. Only 17 others supported him for this. 110 opposed this because so many people had their hands within the USSR. And remember, across Central Asia, they wanted to preserve the USSR. But he turns much more radical. So the demonstrations continue, and they actually increase in number. And Nabiev reacts by creating his own private army, this presidential guard, which he uses to harass oppositionists. Demonstrations were frequently popularly supported, but in two key regions, the Leninabad and the Kulab areas, where the communists still had control, dissenters were intimidated. After you had the shooting of demonstrators in May of 1992, President Nabiev backs down from this abyss, and he looks for compromise. And he creates a government of national reconciliation, again in May of 1992, which includes a handful of oppositionists. But many oppositionists reject this compromise, and two key regions refuse to accept any compromise whatsoever. And these are actually the Leninabads and the Kulabs. And this is important because the Kulabis had earlier been counter demonstrators and therefore given weapons by the government. They were actually given weapons to fight the demonstrators. And now they take a harder line and they create a popular front. They're so upset about this government of national reconciliation, about this giving in, that they create this popular front, which is a military movement in the south, where they're located, that declares the government of national reconciliation illegitimate. This is all about keeping a group of politicians, especially communists, in power. Oh, let me pause for it. I'll stop here and I'll take this up in a second.